Profusely genuine, explosively orthodox. Bones free themselves of flesh, laying waste to needless entrails, revealing a skeleton of extraordinarily strength.
It is with this short, yet incredible description that I was pulled right into the madness that is Angel at Dusk. If you are into shmups or you've always been curious of the genre and don't have a problem with grotesque creatures, skeletons or nudity, this is a guaranteed recommendation for the first game to get this year. From the very beginning, during the initial input setup, the game is already filled with so much personality. The path of shmup games begins here. Please make your choice wisely. Damn, fuck all that real Yakuza user gamepad. Angel at Dusk knows that the cool input method is keyboard arrow keys for the movement. Straight up recommended for genre veterans. The choice is so powerful that the whole thing just explodes. And it just keeps going. Look at this confirmation screen. Venture off to battle satisfied with your finally chosen button settings? Or chagrin your poorly chosen button settings and redo them? It is important to note right away that the game contains a rated 15 mode, also called no nipple mode. You want that turned off for the intended experience, but considering the choice of platform I decided to preach on, I'll have to adhere to the incomplete experience. Just know that for each tear on the screen, there is a point to it. Well, literally. Even then, while it keeps this hardcore appearance at all times, what you'll find here is one of, if not the best starting point for anyone who might be curious about the genre. With a Guilty Gear Revelator tutorial level of care, Angel at Dusk guides you extensively through its esoteric world of flesh and bone, through a step-by-step tutorial that you can replay individually in case you need a refresher on any of its unique systems. As it wasn't enough, it also doesn't mind stripping itself of its hardcore heavy metal identity and shifting to a simple shoot-'em-up to explain all the basics of the genre with clear instructions and playable sections that cover even expert techniques that no game in all of my shmup career has had the decency of explaining me, even less in such a commendable way. This is of course something that comes from the arcade nature of the genre and something the game itself mentions when coming to terms with the flaws that keep it from gathering mainstream attention once again. While the tutorial might drag on for longer than expected, at least they warn you about it in advance, and giving the encouraging and honest presentation of the tutorial, it is charming enough to make completing that mode a pleasurable experience. This of course is not obligatory, and for the first time you're going through its arcade mode, you are presented with quick tips on how to play in such a way that they don't interrupt the flow. On par with the rest of the wicked sense of humor at Angel at Dusk, the first and only selectable difficulty is very hard. As you go through the game, you unlock harder difficulties, but also different angels, which function as different characters, each with unpronounceable names and lengthy descriptions on their specs. The game is divided into 5 stages, and you can easily jump directly into any of them after clicking it once on the selected difficulty. You can even go directly to each boss, so it's easier to try to do each part with no lives lost. If you don't like the classic arcade style of the genre, you also have an original mode, which is described in the story page as a mode where you can upgrade your ship limitlessly with no regards to game balance. Hell yeah, a developer that doesn't mind people having fun. With all of that explained, how's the gameplay? Well, as explained by the trailer, which I recommend everyone to watch even if they don't plan on buying the game, this is a skeletal shmup, a shoot-'em-up 1.0 if you will, which had all of its flesh cut away and all that remains are the bones. A shooter in its purest, fundamental structure. There is nothing new to find here, and yet, this frame is robust. Seriously though, what is here is pretty good. You got the shooting button, accompanied by the much appreciated separate auto shoot button and the bomb button, which only certain characters can use. By holding the shooting button, you also get the expected charge attack, but instead of being a concentrated, high damaging attack, the design here is that the charge attacks are done to clear away bullets, or at least push them away from your path. In a rare type of shmup, Angel at Dusk doesn't have you lose a life when colliding with the enemies or the environment, but instead it shoves you away, possibly into a stray bullet. Coupled together with how you can restore lives by dealing close quarters damage, turns a usually passive genre for the casual player into one of constant hyper-aggression, having much more tangible rewards that incentivize to gamble harder with your life. You can also collect these lipid things, which give you experience until you undergo a power mutation, basically upgrading your character. In a confusing turn of events, the player character gets physically bigger, but the hitbox actually becomes smaller. This bizarre phenomenon is explained in-universe as a representation in increase of avoidance potential as a result of sensory organs and exodermis having gotten stronger. Clearly a big brain move. But still, the close range damage stays the same, so it is possible to clear every stage at the default power level. There are also these funky skeletons that give you a lot of XP and stamina to regain back lost lives, but that's the gist of it. Gameplay is tight, music is amazing, and the style is impetuous. That should be enough to convince you to play Angel at Dusk. There is also a story, which is told through logs that are shown after you clear each stage. You can read them again in the main menu, and if you are into knowing what the fuck is actually happening, well, you have a lot to read here. The synopsis does explain that mankind somehow managed to get rid of all crime, pain and desire, which resulted into transcending into angeldom. But after 2 billion years, the sun has begun expanding, and this paradise is about to be interrupted. Still more sane and coherent than Cruelty Squad, yet still crazy enough to fall into that beautiful schizophrenic genre, Angel at Dusk gets a guaranteed recommendation from me. With its exceptional grotesque aesthetic, Angel at Dusk appears to be a pretty unique game even outside of its own genre, right? Well, not really. This is just the latest point in the interesting career of the developer, Akiragoya, and one I believe deserves a deep dive, at least as deep as the language barrier allows me. First of all, Akiragoya is just one of his many internet handles that categorize his works. If my research hasn't failed me, his real name is Itaba Haruo, or Sakaba Haruo, as he used to go as during his BBS days, which were the equivalent to internet forums of nowadays. Nevertheless, I shall use Akiragoya when referencing him, so it's more consistent with his more recent work. Exploring the ramifications from this has led me down a fascinating spiral into a piece of the old 1.0 web, with a similar sense of wonder reminiscent of those days, where you would stumble into a series of hyperlinks and dive into the unknown and the unrestricted in a mix of fear and curiosity. On his personal website, he defines his main interests being heavy metal and science fiction novels, which, yeah, it shows. That would also explain the absolute raw energy of his words. At first I thought this was just a quirk of reading about his work through a machine translation, but after having played Angel at Dusk, it just goes really hard on that heavy metal. While Angel at Dusk seems to be a rare fetishistic game at first, Akiragoya has been at it since '93, starting in an X68000 series computer before jumping into Windows. In a particular section of his own chronology of works, he goes into depth of how he started by participating in a particular Disc magazine, an old form of community around personal computer fanatics that has been long superseded by the internet. These were magazines where readers could pitch in with their own software creations, like music, illustrations and even games, which would then get all published together and released for the public. Akiragoya recalls how he's made a point of sending a new game for each issue, and despite the user reach being quite small in comparison to today's numbers, it felt like the interactions between readers were more personal and meaningful. This entire chronology is a great read, as it goes into detailed depth of how he tried to develop games without ever focusing on any particular genre. From fighting games to platformers and even dungeon crawlers, he shares his honest feelings for each past work in a bittersweet sense of nostalgia that an artist is sure to relate with. While he thinks poorly of his early creations, he still looks at it fondly and even openly admits to reusing certain parts for later projects. It's incredible how this series of interwoven worlds created over the years have been obscured not just because of the language, but also because of the sensitive topics that it dwells into. In the QA section of one of his old games, he claims that he would like to sell it to an overseas audience, but the content could make it difficult. Hell, the Angel at Dusk section of his page declares that the no nipples mode is a great feature that takes into account the current world situation, which is simultaneously funny and depressing. Here you can also read how Angel at Dusk took 4 years to make, and how it was based on a game he made on 2 weeks before. If there was one message, one feeling I could transmit directly to him is that it was totally worth it, cause the game is fucking awesome. Unfortunately, all of those X68,000 games are now lost to time, as Akiragoya directly says that they are so bad that it is better for they are forgotten. Well, all but one called Death Ephemera, which had some sample footage and this cool-ass poster. On the other hand, most of his Windows-based projects seem to be playable even to this day, or at least the demo versions, which is a pretty impressive feat when you consider the arduous task of running old games on modern hardware. One day I'll be able to easily replay Black and White, it's just not going to be today. Around 2004, Akiragoya started publishing his work under the group called Akira Hut Original, with the first project being Gullshell, a grotesque shmup with a tagline defining it as a sexual subspace shooting game. This is the first recorded point of the style that is so characteristic of Akiragoya's work, likely inspired by the surrealist biomechanical art style of the great H.R. Giger. It takes it a step further by distancing himself from the cold tones of metal, and instead distorts the biological into machine-like creatures of flesh and bone. As if the horrifying visuals weren't enough, the story description doesn't shy away from scaring the player with such a bleak setting that it turns around into being comical. For example, the protagonist is described as a, and I quote, 24-year-old serial killer with large breasts, who murdered 8 high school girls after dismantling them alive. She recorded and then proceeded to distribute the video recordings of her crimes on the internet. She was then shot dead by the police and later resuscitated by a corrupt deputy, which was the father of one of the victims, torturing her to the point of mutilation. But because of her unique mental structure, she is able to withstand the strain of traveling through subspace, so she is fused into a biological subspace fighter and forced to fight against the incoming threat. I find it fascinating how this manages to tread the limits of both American and European sensibilities, as it surpasses the boundaries of both the erotic and the violent and mixes it all together into this perverted vision. It's actually a pretty fun, albeit simple game, one which you can grab for free and play it for yourself if you want to. At the same time, under the separate moniker of Arts Night, Akiragoya begins to publish sets of hardcore erotic illustrations based on characters from other franchises like Guilty Gear and even the Neo Geo classic Galaxy Fight. Say what you want, but at least the man has good taste. As I can't possibly show it directly here, I can at least present the description for each one. This one is pictures of hot chicks with rabbit ears and big breasts. And this one is pictures of cat girls who are humiliated by pigs. In most images, girls wear sailor-style uniforms and knee socks. But as his biggest interest was still video games, this led to the start of his longest-running series, called Yakoga. Combining all of his previous experience, the first one is an horizontal shmup, which rewards the player with erotic illustrations for each completed stage. The sequel is not much different, with the gimmick being the time limit, forcing you to control your speed to get to the end in time. But then the third one, out of nowhere, is an action RPG where you wander through a vast labyrinth. In the middle of all of that, Hellbound also gets released, another freeware shmup where you can deflect enemy bullets. It's described as having a story with no ending, but he exclaims I will make one if he feels like it, which hasn't happened since then. This sort of attitude is in plenty across his entire body of work. Later on he would create a webcomic called King of Pain, which is also indefinitely suspended. But even so, I'm absolutely in love with the use of short GIFs to convey motion and emotion. After all of that, a critical point for the series and niche shmups in general, as Yakoga 4, still considered by many to be one of the best Akiragoya's games, is released with usual hardcore visuals, but also with an all-ages version, As in his blog, he explains how he received many letters proclaiming how they don't want erotic content in the game. In this version, the bosses won't appear naked, and there aren't any erotic illustrations after each stage. Even then, with character designs like this, the game is still pretty lewd, so I find it pretty pointless. Before Yakuga 5, Akiragoya releases another shmup based on the then brand new mascot for a boy synthesizer titled Miku's Multiplying Spiral, where you control Hatsune Miku going around shooting down aliens and stopping bullets with her long twin tails. Crazy stuff, really. There was also supposed to be a sequel to Gull Shell, and you could still play its demo version, but that has also been marked as suspended indefinitely. From Yakuga 5 onward, the most hardcore parts are left behind, while still having big ass titties everywhere. Can't take those away from a man, and I respect him for that. As a quick side project, Kikai Shushi, Machine Seed gets released in what I can only describe it as a mix between Terminator and Strike Witches. I shall not elaborate further on that. From this point onward, it gets even more confusing as Yakuga 7 releases first, and it's an action platformer of all things. While pretty simple, it's still pretty fun. Another side project, and one that will later mark the first entry to be officially localized and sold on Steam, is Maidens of a Holodream. Which, while putting aside all the usual biomechanical grotesque stuff, it's still pretty raunchy, as it describes itself as being the world's #1 My Body loincloth team shooter. I don't know what that is about, but it seems pretty lewd. Oh, okay then, it isn't. Then back to completing Yakuga 6, which despite its number doesn't have much story relation to Yakuga 5. But this time we shift the perspective from horizontal to vertical, in tune to what shmups are mostly associated with. Like what seems to be the rhythm now, Akiragoya releases yet another standalone title called Metal Musket, and this is to date the most normal shmup he has released, just a straight up shooter with flying ships and no flesh or bone in sight. This would later get localized to Steam, but it goes by the title of Steel Vampire. Both are pretty cool names nevertheless. Then we are back into the confusing series of developments in the Yakuga series, where the 8th game goes back to being an action platformer, but then a second 8th goes back to being a vertical shmup, while actually being the 9th entry in the series. It's just Akiragoya planned on having multiple characters, but then things got out of control and he just decided to separate those into separate games, so it's considered a Yakuga 8, but not really. Lastly, another standalone title similar to Steel Vampire is now in development, with Angel at Dusk being the latest one you can actually play from start to end. Seriously impressive how he managed to release so many games for so long. It's really motivating to see someone work so hard on what they really love. Makes me want to also keep going and get better at everything I do. This has me reflecting about Toho and the evolution of that franchise as a whole. While it began as a simple shmup series by the hands of one developer, the fanworks really pushed it beyond its limits and across the entire world. A shame that Akiragoya's work has never gotten the recognition that it deserves, but unfortunately that is the expected result of trying to explore the sensitive nature of the topics that he so enjoys. Honestly, I look at Akiragoya the same way I look at Yoko Taro. They both share a brutal and outspoken honesty in the pursuit of their ambition, with the only real difference being how one managed to stumble his way to popular cult status. Yoko Taro is also not afraid to admit of how much he likes Ikaruga, so this connection might not be so strange after all. If anything, I hope this in-depth look into this unfairly obscure creator as more people get interested in his games and other creations, or at the very least, take into themselves his unrelenting energy and determination, which the rest of the world could always use more of.